A woman falls into ecstasy in a stone chapel. Angels descend with fire and piercing light. The soul, she wrote, knows what it cannot speak. Subscribe if you love Jesus. The painting hangs in the Cornaro Chapel of Santa Maria della Vittoria in Rome, Bernini's masterwork carved from marble in 1652. A woman reclines, her body suspended between earth and heaven, her face transfixed in an expression that defies classification. Pain or pleasure, agony or rapture, death or transcendence. An angel hovers above her, drawing back a golden arrow, preparing to pierce her heart once more. The sculpture captures a moment described in the saint's own words, written decades earlier in a manuscript that would become one of the most influential texts in Christian mysticism. But the question that haunts both the sculpture and the text is older than art, deeper than theology. What happens when the infinite touches the finite, when God invades human consciousness, when vision replaces sight and language fails before the weight of what has been seen? Her name was Teresa de Cepeda y Ahumada, born March 28, 1515, in Ávila, a walled city in the high plateau of Castile, Spain, in the early 16th century, was a nation at the height of imperial power and religious ferment. The Reconquista had concluded only 23 years before Teresa's birth, the last Muslim kingdom expelled, the Inquisition established to enforce Catholic orthodoxy. Her family were conversos, descendants of Jews who had converted to Christianity, a heritage that carried both privilege and suspicion in a society obsessed with limpieza de sangre, purity of blood. Teresa's childhood was marked by extremes. She read tales of saints and martyrs, played at being a hermit with her brother, and at age 7 attempted to run away to Moorish lands seeking martyrdom, a plan thwarted by an uncle who found the children on the road. Her mother died when Teresa was 14, a loss that drove her toward deeper piety and, paradoxically, toward a period of vanity and worldliness that troubled her conscience for years afterward. At 20, against her father's initial wishes, she entered the Carmelite convent of the Incarnation in Ávila. The convent was large, housing more than 150 nuns, and operated under a relaxed rule that permitted personal property, frequent visitors, and extended absences. It was more social salon than cloister, a respectable refuge for women of good families. Teresa spent nearly 3 decades there, struggling with illness, battling spiritual dryness, and wrestling with a prayer life that seemed to yield nothing but frustration. For 18 years, she later wrote, she experienced what spiritual directors call aridity, the sense of God's absence, the failure of prayer to produce consolation or insight. She continued the disciplines of religious life mechanically, without enthusiasm, tormented by the gap between the sanctity she sought and the mediocrity she felt. Contemporary spiritual writings emphasize that such periods are common, even necessary, in the development of deep faith. But for Teresa, isolated in a religious community that prized propriety over profundity, the experience was a form of interior exile. Then, at age 39, something shifted. The accounts vary in details, but the substance is clear. Teresa began experiencing what she called raptures, ecstasies, visions that seized her consciousness without warning and left her unable to move or speak. These were not gentle meditations or pious imaginings, but overwhelming invasions of her normal awareness, experiences she described with the language of violence and fire. The most famous vision, immortalized in Bernini's sculpture, occurred around 1560. Teresa described it in her autobiography. Written under obedience to her confessor, an angel appeared beside her, not tall but beautiful, his face aflame with light. In his hand, a golden spear tipped with fire. He plunged the spear into her heart repeatedly, withdrawing it and leaving her, she wrote, all on fire with a great love of God. The pain was so extreme it caused her to moan, yet so sweet she desired it never to end. The experience left physical effects. She could not stand, could barely speak, and remained in that state for hours or days. Modern readers struggle with such accounts. Skeptics dismiss them as hysteria, epilepsy, or the psychosomatic manifestations of repressed sexuality in a cloistered environment. Psychologists have analyzed Teresa's writings through Freudian and Jungian frameworks, finding patterns consistent with dissociative states or temporal lobe phenomena. Some feminist scholars read her visions as subversive acts of agency in a patriarchal system, her ecstasies providing authority that education and ordination denied. But Teresa's own descriptions resist these reductions. She was educated, intelligent, and keenly aware of the dangers of delusion. She consulted priests, theologians, and spiritual directors, subjecting her experiences to scrutiny and doubt. She distinguished carefully between imagination, intellectual vision, and what she called imaginative vision, categories drawn from medieval mystical theology, but refined through her own discernment. She knew the risks of claiming direct communication with God in a Spain where the Inquisition prosecuted alumbrados, Illuminists who claimed private revelation superseded church authority. Her writings describe multiple types of mystical experience. Some visions were intellectual, occurring without images, a direct apprehension of divine presence that bypassed sense and imagination. Others were imaginative, presenting symbolic or literal scenes to her interior sight. She saw Christ beside her during prayer, his presence so tangible she could describe his appearance, though she emphasized the vision was not physical but impressed directly on her soul. She experienced locutions, words spoken not to her ears but directly to her understanding, more certain than any sound. The content of these visions often addressed her personal struggles and called her to action. She saw the depths of hell, a vision so terrifying she resolved to reform the Carmelite Order to save souls from that fate. She saw heaven and understood, she wrote, that no description could capture its reality, that language was dust before the weight of divine glory. She received what she described as spiritual marriage with Christ, a union so complete it transformed her understanding of selfhood, dissolving the boundary between her will and God's. In 1562, at age 47, Teresa founded the convent of St. Joseph in Ávila, the first house of the Discalced Carmelites, shoeless, indicating their return to the order's original austere rule. The reform was radical. The new convent housed only 13 nuns, embraced poverty without mitigation, maintained strict enclosure, and dedicated itself to contemplative prayer. The establishment met fierce opposition from the Carmelites of the Incarnation, from civic authorities, and from elements within the church hierarchy who saw no need for reform and suspected Teresa's visions as delusional or demonic. Over the next 20 years, Teresa founded 16 more convents across Spain, traveling by donkey cart over rough roads, negotiating with bishops and nobles, raising funds, training novices, and writing extensively. Her travels were exhausting, her health perpetually fragile, her reception often hostile. She faced investigations by the Inquisition, denunciations from fellow Carmelites, and constant scrutiny from confessors uncertain whether her experiences came from God or darker sources. Her writings from this period combine practical wisdom with mystical depth. The Way of Perfection, written for her nuns, offers guidance on prayer and community life, with a directness and humor rare in religious literature. The interior castle, completed in 1577, describes the soul as a mansion with 7 levels of dwelling places, each representing deeper intimacy with God. The journey inward is also a journey upward, through states of prayer, from vocal recitation through meditation, contemplation, and finally to union, where the soul loses itself in God and finds itself transformed. Teresa's descriptions of advanced prayer states remain some of the most detailed in Christian mystical literature. She distinguished between the prayer of quiet, where the will rests in God while the intellect wanders, the prayer of union, where all faculties are bound in divine presence, and the prayer of ecstatic union, where the soul is suspended, unable to function normally, caught up in rapture. She described spiritual betrothal and spiritual marriage, the latter being a permanent state of union that does not depend on felt experience, but represents a fundamental reordering of the person toward God. Scholars debate how to interpret these states. Some see them as genuine encounters with divine reality, experiences that transcend normal consciousness and provide access to truths unavailable through reason or sense. Others view them as psychological phenomena, the brain's capacity for altered states of consciousness. Meaningful perhaps, but not supernatural. Neurological research has identified correlates of mystical experience in brain activity, particularly in the temporal and parietal lobes. But correlation does not resolve causation. The brain activity may produce the experience, or the experience may produce the brain activity, or both may be effects of a third cause, the touch of something beyond measurement. Teresa herself insisted on the necessity of discernment. Not all visions were divine. Some came from imagination, some from demons who could appear as angels of light. The test was fruit, not feeling. Did the experience produce humility, charity, obedience, peace? Did it strengthen virtue and deepen love of God and neighbor? Experiences that produced pride, confusion, or disobedience were suspect, regardless of how compelling they seemed. She developed criteria for authentic mystical experience that remain influential in Catholic spiritual direction. Consistency with Scripture and church teaching, production of virtue, submission to authority, and the simultaneous increase of both confidence in God and humility about oneself. Her relationship with St. John of the Cross, the poet and mystic who collaborated in the Carmelite reform, provided theological depth to her practical work. John's writings on the dark night of the soul complemented Teresa's emphasis on divine union, describing the stripping away of attachment that precedes transformation. Together, they articulated a mystical theology that balanced apophatic and cataphatic approaches, the way of negation and the way of affirmation, the darkness beyond concepts and the intimate personal encounter. The Inquisition investigated Teresa multiple times. Her writings were examined for doctrinal error. Her claims to private revelation raised suspicions of Illuminism. Her Jewish ancestry added another layer of scrutiny in a society where converso background attracted automatic suspicion. She navigated these dangers with a combination of humility, wit, and strategic obedience, submitting her writings to censors while preserving their essential content, accepting correction while defending her experiences as genuine. She died on October 4, 1582, in Alba de Tormes, worn out by travel and illness at age 67. Her body was initially buried there, but tradition holds that it remained incorrupt, a claim investigated and documented by church authorities in subsequent examinations. Her left hand was preserved as a relic and remains on display. She was beatified in 1614 and canonized in 1622 by Pope Gregory XV. In 1970, Pope Paul VI declared her a Doctor of the Church, the first woman to receive that title. recognizing her as a teacher whose writings have universal significance for understanding faith. Her influence extends beyond Catholicism. Mystics and contemplatives across traditions recognize in her descriptions experiences parallel to their own, the phenomenology of mystical states, the dissolution of subject-object duality, the ineffability of the experience, the sense of unity with ultimate reality, appears in Buddhist, Hindu, Sufi, and Jewish mystical literature with remarkable consistency. Whether these similarities indicate a common neurological substrate, a shared human capacity for transcendence, or genuine contact with a reality that expresses itself through diverse cultural and religious forms remains disputed. Teresa's writings have been analyzed by philosophers, psychologists, and literary scholars. William James discussed her in The Varieties of Religious Experience as an exemplar of mystical consciousness. Simone de Beauvoir examined her in The Second Sex as a woman who achieved autonomy through religion. Contemporary theologians continue to mine her work for insights into prayer, spiritual development, and the nature of religious experience. The visions themselves remain irreducible to explanation. Either they were what Teresa claimed, encounters with divine reality that exceeded her capacity to comprehend or communicate, or they were psychological phenomena that felt like encounters with something beyond the self. The distinction matters for theology, but perhaps less for understanding Teresa's significance. Her importance lies not only in what she saw, but in what she did with what she saw. She reformed an order, founded 17 convents, wrote books that have guided millions, and demonstrated that mystical experience, far from separating one from the world, can provide energy and vision for transforming it. The interior castle remains her most systematic work, a map of spiritual development that has guided seekers for over 4 centuries. The image of the soul as a crystal castle with many rooms, each illuminated by the light of God at the center, captures both the beauty and complexity of interior life. The journey through the mansions is not linear but spiraling, returning to earlier stages with new understanding, facing new challenges at each level. The goal is not spiritual achievement, but self-surrender, the loss of self-will in divine will, a union that does not destroy personhood, but fulfills it. Her descriptions of the 7th mansion, the place of spiritual marriage, attempt to articulate a state where union with God becomes constant and natural. The soul no longer struggles to pray or maintain awareness of divine presence. God dwells in the center, and from that center, the soul acts with complete freedom, its will perfectly aligned with divine purpose without constraint or effort. Martha and Mary unite. Action and contemplation no longer oppose, but flow from a single source. Critics note the dangers of mysticism unmoored from community and tradition. Spiritual experiences can become addictive, pursued for their own sake rather than as means to holiness. Claims to private revelation can justify rebellion against legitimate authority or provide cover for mental illness. Teresa anticipated these dangers and insisted on obedience to the Church, submission of her experiences to learned confessors, and constant testing of visions against Scripture and doctrine. The question remains whether her visions revealed objective truth or reflected subjective experience. The distinction may be less clear than it appears if consciousness is not an epiphenomenon, but participates in reality at its deepest level. Then mystical experience might provide access to dimensions of existence unavailable to ordinary awareness. The mystic does not invent, but discovers, not by reasoning, but by direct apprehension, a knowing that exceeds the categories of subject and object. Teresa's legacy endures in the 17 Carmelite convents she founded, in the thousands of monasteries following the Reformed rule, in the millions who have read her works and found in them guidance for their own journey. Her feast day, October 15th, is celebrated throughout the Catholic world. Pilgrims visit her tomb in Alba de Tormes and the convents she established in Ávila, seeking connection with a woman who 6 centuries ago dared to speak of experiences that exceeded language and yet found words to point toward what she had seen. The visions that seized Teresa in chapel and cell remain beyond verification or falsification. Science can map brain states, but cannot measure the sacred. Theology can categorize experiences, but cannot produce them. What remains is her testimony, offered with humility and precision, of a reality that broke into ordinary life and transformed it, of encounters that defied comprehension, yet demanded response, of a God who came not in doctrine or duty, but in fire and piercing light, leaving the soul wounded and awake, burning with a love that could not be extinguished and would not be denied. Teresa of Ávila saw what she saw, wrote what she could, and lived what she learned. The mansions of the interior castle remain open to those willing to enter. The path inward still leads upward, and the testimony of one woman's visions continues to illuminate the way for seekers who follow, stumbling through darkness toward the light that Teresa swore was real, more real than stone or flesh, more certain than anything the senses could report. The light that burns at the center of the soul, waiting to be found.